Andrew's hand slid around the blonde's waist with a practiced smile. The kind of gesture he had perfected over 5 years of meticulously constructed lies. The ballroom of the Millennium Tower in Chicago glittered under crystal chandeliers, filled with Hansen and Partners executives, high on the last quarter's success and the French champagne that flowed ceaselessly. No one there knew that the company's most coveted man, the CFO everyone admired for his successful single life, was hiding a truth about to implode. Rachel watched from the entrance, her green eyes fixed on the husband who had pretended to be wifeless since accepting his promotion. She wore an elegant black dress, her brown hair pulled back in an immaculate bun, holding a leather brief that contained much more than corporate documents. It held 5 years of silent humiliation, of lonely nights in the Oak Park house Andrew rarely visited, of invented excuses for family members who asked why he never showed up at gatherings or holidays. Jazz music played softly while Andrew whispered something into the blonde's ear, eliciting a crystalline laugh that echoed through the hall. It was Jennifer, the new marketing manager, recently divorced and clearly interested in the man everyone believed to be available. Rachel recognized the pattern. In recent years, there had been at least 4 different Jennifers, all believing Andrew was free. All fed the same carefully manufactured fantasy. What none of them knew was that Rachel was not just the forgotten wife. She was Rachel Monroe, a forensic accounting graduate from Northwestern University, specializing in financial crime auditing. And in the last 6 weeks, since Hansen and Partners had hired the external firm Morrison and Associates to investigate irregularities in tax reports, she had delved deep into the company's records and her own husband's financial secrets. What she had discovered was extraordinary in its audacity. Andrew had not only hidden her from the corporate world, but had systematically siphoned funds from their joint account, subtle transfers that amounted to nearly $200,000 over the years. Money that had financed the luxurious Gold Coast apartment he secretly maintained, expensive dinners with colleagues and potential romantic interests, designer clothes, the Porsche he claimed to have bought with non-existent bonuses. Rachel crossed the ballroom with measured steps, each movement calculated. She had waited 5 years for this moment, ever since that first company party, when Andrew had asked her not to show up, saying it would be weird since no one knew about them yet. A lie that had multiplied into hundreds of others, each one building the prison where he had voluntarily locked their marriage. Marcus Henderson, the CEO of Hansen and Partners, waved to her from the bar. He was a 60-year-old man with graying hair and piercing eyes, known for his intolerance of dishonesty. Rachel returned the nod, approaching him while Andrew remained distracted with Jennifer on the other side of the room. "Ms. Monroe," Marcus greeted, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I know you usually send reports via email from Morrison, but I prefer to discuss sensitive matters in person." The sensitivity of this particular case indeed requires an in-person approach, Rachel replied, her voice firm, especially considering the personal implications involved. Marcus frowned, intrigued. "Personal implications?" Before Rachel could answer, a familiar voice interrupted. "Marcus, you have to meet." Andrew stopped mid-sentence, his face paling as his eyes met Rachel's. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops onto the Armani suit he had surely bought with money that wasn't solely his. "Andrew," Marcus smiled, oblivious to the tension. "Perfect. I was just talking to Morrison's auditor. Ms. Monroe, this is Andrew Brennan, our CFO." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but to Andrew, it must have felt like an eternity. Rachel watched every micro-expression cross his face. Shock, fear, confusion, and finally, thinly veiled desperation. "Actually, Rachel said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We already know each other. Quite well, in fact." Andrew tried to smile, but the result was a pathetic grimace. I don't remember. Perhaps at a conference?" "Not at a conference." Rachel turned to Marcus, maintaining a professional tone. "Andrew and I have been married for 7 years. Legally married, although he has omitted this fact from everyone in this company for the past 5. The jazz music continued to play, but around them, conversations began to cease. Heads turned, curious gazes fixed on the trio. Jennifer, still nearby, dropped her champagne flute, which shattered on the marble floor with a sound that seemed amplified in the sudden silence. Marcus looked from Rachel to Andrew, processing the information. "Married? Andrew? Is this true?" Andrew opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Marcus, I can explain." Please, explain," Rachel cut in, opening her brief. "But while you're at it, perhaps you'd also like to explain these transfers." She placed a stack of documents on the bar counter. $193,000 siphoned from our joint marital account over the past 5 years. Money you used to finance a lifestyle that sustained your lie of being single. More people approached now, the circle around them growing. Rachel could see familiar faces from photos Andrew kept on his phone, people he called friends, but who never knew of her existence. She also saw the women, 3 of them present at this party, with whom he had flirted, or perhaps more, over the years. "But that's not all," Rachel continued, pulling out another set of documents. "During my audit of Hansen and Partners records, I discovered something interesting. You falsified expense reports, Andrew. Business dinners that were actually personal dates. Corporate trips to Miami and Las Vegas that the company paid for, but which had no real commercial purpose. In total, approximately $85,000 in corporate fraud." Marcus's face turned red. "Andrew, are these accusations true?" Andrew had lost all color. His hands were visibly trembling now, the whiskey glass swaying dangerously. "Rachel, please, can we talk about this in private? You don't understand." "I don't understand." Rachel's voice rose for the first time, years of contained pain leaking through her professional mask. "I don't understand what it's like to be erased from your own husband's life. What it's like to lie to your own mother about why you never come for Christmas. What it's like to sleep alone in an empty house while you're here, pretending to be someone else." Jennifer recoiled from Andrew as if he had burned her. Others also drew back, creating an empty space around him, a physical isolation that reflected the social one he was about to face. "Mr. Henderson," Rachel turned her attention back to the CEO, composing herself. "My full report will be submitted tomorrow morning, but I thought it appropriate that you know personally, before this becomes a formal legal matter, that your CFO not only committed corporate fraud, but also used company resources to sustain a deliberately constructed double life." Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Andrew, you are suspended immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You will receive communication from our lawyers." The party had died completely now. Everyone watched as 2 security guards appeared, flanking Andrew. He looked at Rachel one last time, and she saw something that might have been remorse, or perhaps just fear of the consequences. As they escorted him out, Rachel allowed herself a moment of deep breath. 5 years of silence. Ended. 5 years of being invisible, exposed to the light. The ballroom gradually returned to life, but now the whispers were about her, about Andrew, about the revelation that would turn them both into a Chicago corporate legend. Rachel picked up her brief and turned to leave. But Marcus stopped her. "Ms. Monroe, I'm sorry for what you went through. This does not reflect our company's values." She nodded, allowing herself a small, bitter smile. "No, Mr. Henderson. This reflects the choices of a man who decided his image was worth more than his marriage, and that other people's money was an acceptable price for that fantasy." The Millennium Tower's underground parking lot was almost empty when Rachel finally left the building. Her heels echoed against the cold concrete, each step marking the distance between the woman who had entered the party and the one now walking towards her modest Honda Civic. Her hands still trembled slightly, the adrenaline of the last 40 minutes beginning to dissipate, leaving in its place a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and a rage that had festered for so long it had become part of her essence. She hadn't planned to confront Andrew publicly. The audit report was supposed to be delivered discreetly to Morrison and Associates' legal department on Monday, triggering a formal, impersonal process. But when she received the holiday party invitation as a professional courtesy, something inside her snapped. Perhaps it was the fact that the invitation had come signed by Andrew himself, with no recognition of who she was. Just Ms. Rachel Monroe, Morrison and Associates, as if they were strangers. Inside the car, Rachel rested her forehead against the steering wheel, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what she had just done. Her phone vibrated insistently in her purse, likely messages from Morrison colleagues who had already heard about the incident. News like this traveled fast in Chicago's corporate circles. By tomorrow morning, half the financial district would know of Andrew Brennan's spectacular fall. The memory came without warning, as it always did in moments of vulnerability. 7 years ago, in a modest cafe in Evanston, Andrew had knelt with a simple ring they had chosen together, because back then they shared everything, including the tight finances of 2 recent graduates trying to build a life. He worked as a junior accountant at a small firm. She was finishing her master's degree. They were happy in their simplicity, or so Rachel had believed. The change had begun when Andrew received the offer from Hansen & Partners, a salary that tripled what he earned, generous benefits, a clear path to directorship. Rachel had been genuinely happy for him, proud even. They celebrated with cheap wine and Chinese food, planning how the extra money would finally allow them to buy a house, perhaps start a family. The first lie was small, almost imperceptible. Andrew had suggested he go alone to the company's welcome party. "It's just a boring work thing," he had said. "You'd be bored." Rachel had agreed, suspecting nothing. The second lie came weeks later, when Andrew casually mentioned he had omitted his marital status on his employee registration. "I forgot to fill out that part," he explained, with a carefree smile. But the lies grew, branching out like weeds in a neglected garden. Corporate events she was never invited to. Weekends he spent working on urgent projects. The joint account that began to bleed money into transfers Andrew claimed were investments, business opportunities, necessary expenses for his professional image. Rachel wasn't naive. She had noticed the changes, the growing distances. But confronting him would mean admitting that something was fundamentally broken. And for a long time, she preferred to believe the excuses, the promises that things would return to normal after the next promotion, the next important project. The breaking point had come 6 months ago, in a mundane yet devastating way. Rachel had stumbled upon Andrew at an Italian restaurant in River North, sitting at an intimate table with a woman she didn't know. There would have been nothing suspicious about it if not for the way he touched her arm, the smile Rachel hadn't seen directed at herself in years. But what truly destroyed her was hearing, as she passed unnoticed behind them, Andrew answer the woman's question about serious relationships by saying, "No, Nothing serious. I'm married to my job, I guess. That night, for the first time in their marriage, Rachel opened Andrew's laptop while he slept. What she found was a meticulously organized digital file of a parallel life. Photos on his private social media profile where there was no trace of her. Messages exchanged with co-workers where he talked about dates, about being on the market, about the freedom of having no commitments. Emails discussing the Gold Coast apartment she knew nothing about, planning trips he had never mentioned. The initial shock had given way to a cold, calculating fury. Rachel began to document everything. Every suspicious transfer, every unjustifiable expense, every lie she could track. When Morrison and Associates assigned her to the Hansen & Partners audit 3 months later, she initially considered refusing due to a conflict of interest. But then she realized the universe was offering her a perfect opportunity to not only expose Andrew's personal lies, but also to find out if his dishonesty extended to his professional life. She discovered that it did. Andrew had been meticulous in concealing his wife, but careless in hiding his corporate financial crimes. The fraudulent expense reports were amateurish in their execution. Personal trips masked as business, easily exposed. It was almost as if part of him wanted to be caught, as if the weight of all the lies was becoming too heavy to bear. The phone vibrated again, this time with a call. The name on the screen made Rachel hesitate before answering. Patricia Brennan, her mother-in-law, the woman for whom, for 5 years, Rachel had invented excuses to explain why Andrew could never visit her in Madison, Wisconsin. Imaginary illnesses, urgent projects, unavoidable commitments, all to protect the lies of a man who clearly didn't deserve such loyalty. "Hello, Patricia," Rachel answered, her voice carefully neutral. "Rachel, dear, what's going on?" The older woman's voice was laden with confusion and concern. "Andrew just called me, saying nonsensical things about you ruining his career, about an audit and public exposure. He was almost hysterical." Rachel closed her eyes, considering how much she should reveal. Patricia had always been kind to her, genuinely fond. She didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of her son's collapse. "Patricia, there's a lot you don't know about the past 5 years," Rachel began carefully. "Things Andrew hid not only from his colleagues and employers, but also from family." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Rachel could imagine the woman sitting in her cozy kitchen, processing the implications of what she was hearing. "He hid you," Patricia finally said, not as a question, but as a painful realization. "That's why he never came home, isn't it? That's why there were always excuses." "Yes," Rachel confirmed softly. "He built an entire life where I didn't exist, and in the process, he committed corporate fraud and siphoned nearly $200,000 from our joint account to sustain that fantasy." Patricia let out a sound that could have been a sob or a sharp intake of breath. "My God, Rachel, I didn't know. If I had known—" "I know you didn't know, and I'm so sorry all of this is collapsing this way." Rachel truly felt it. Patricia didn't deserve to find out she had raised a son capable of such elaborate and sustained dishonesty. "What are you going to do now?" Patricia asked after a moment. It was a question Rachel had been avoiding, even for herself. What would come after the exposure? After the dust settled, and Andrew faced the consequences of his actions? They were still legally married, bound by papers that now seemed like documents of a shared fiction. "I'm going to move forward," Rachel replied, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "I will submit the full audit report, cooperate with any legal investigation, and then I will rebuild the life Andrew decided to erase." After hanging up, Rachel finally started the car. The city of Chicago stretched beyond the underground parking lot, lights gleaming against the December night sky. Somewhere out there, Andrew was dealing with the consequences of his choices. She felt no satisfaction in this, she realized. Just a profound emptiness, where love, trust, and shared hope used to exist. But there was also something new growing in that empty space. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was more like freedom, the dizzying sensation of finally stopping carrying a burden that should never have been hers to begin with. As she drove through the familiar streets toward the house in Oak Park, Rachel allowed herself to think about the future for the first time in years. A future where she wouldn't have to lie to protect someone else's lies, where she could rebuild relationships she had neglected, pursue opportunities she had put off, simply exist without being invisible. The traffic light turned red at the corner of Roosevelt and Michigan Avenue. Rachel stopped, watching the few pedestrians hurrying against the cold winter wind. A young mother pushing a stroller, an elderly couple walking hand in hand. Ordinary lives, not spectacular, but real and lived openly. When the light turned green, Rachel accelerated, leaving behind the financial district with its towering skyscrapers and corporate secrets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, decisions that would shape the rest of her life. But tonight, she would simply drive home and finally sleep with a clear conscience for the first time in 5 long years. The house in Oak Park was exactly as Rachel had left it the morning before, but it felt completely different. The light from the living room lamp cast familiar shadows on the cream-colored walls. The accounting books still piled on the dining table where she had worked late, documenting Andrew's frauds. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time in 5 years, these walls no longer held secrets that suffocated her. Rachel left her purse on the sofa and walked into the kitchen, her feet aching from the high heels she had worn all night. The refrigerator was practically empty, just expired milk and 3-day-old Chinese takeout. Andrew never ate at home. She rarely had the energy to cook just for herself. The house was less a home and more a stage where they both performed empty roles in the rare moments he appeared. The phone vibrated again. This time it was Diane Cartwright, her supervisor at Morrison & Associates. Rachel considered ignoring it, but knew she would eventually have to face this conversation. "Rachel, I just received 4 calls about what happened at Hansen & Partners." Diane's voice was a mix of concern and something that might have been professional irritation. "Do you want to explain why our auditor publicly confronted the CFO of an important client, revealing a personal relationship that should have been declared as a conflict of interest from the start?" Rachel sank heavily into a kitchen chair. "Diane, I know how this looks, but when I took the case, I had no idea I would uncover corporate fraud directly linked to Andrew. And yes, I should have disclosed the marriage immediately. But you were so busy being the humiliated wife that you lost your professional judgment?" Diane sighed deeply. "Rachel, I understand what you've been through. I genuinely do. But you've put the firm in an extremely delicate position. Hansen & Partners could argue that the entire audit was compromised by personal bias." The accusation hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. She had been so careful with the numbers, so meticulous in documenting every irregularity. The idea that her work could be dismissed due to personal issues was unbearable. "The evidence is solid," Rachel argued, her voice gaining firmness. "Every document, every transaction, every falsified report is documented and can be independently verified. My relationship with Andrew does not change the facts, of what he did. It doesn't change the facts, but it significantly complicates the presentation of those facts, Diane retorted. Morrison has a reputation to uphold. We cannot appear to use audits as personal revenge by employees. Vengeance. The word echoed in Rachel's mind. Was that what she had done? Turned a legitimate investigation into a personal vendetta? She mentally revisited every step of the audit, every decision she had made. The irregularities were real. The fraud was verifiable. If any other auditor had reviewed the same records, they would have reached the same conclusions. Diane, if you review my work, you'll see that every conclusion is justified by the data, Rachel said calmly. I agree that I should have declared the conflict of interest immediately. That was an error in judgment on my part, and I take full responsibility for it. But please, don't let that oversight undermine the validity of the investigation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for long seconds. Rachel could imagine Diane in her immaculate office in the Loop, pondering the legal and reputational implications of the situation. Monday morning, I want you in the office by 7, Diane finally said. Bring all documentation. We will have an independent team reviewing every aspect of your audit. If we find any evidence that you fabricated or exaggerated findings for personal reasons, you will be fired and likely face legal consequences. Am I clear? Perfectly clear. After the call ended, Rachel remained seated in the dark kitchen for a long time. Exhaustion finally caught up with her, not just physical, but emotional. She had spent so much time planning this moment, imagining what it would be like to expose Andrew and his lies, that she hadn't fully considered the ramifications for herself. Her career could be ruined. Morrison & Associates was one of the most respected auditing firms in the Midwest. If they fired her with a blemish on her record, finding another job in forensic accounting would be almost impossible. And her marriage, already a skeleton for years, was officially dead. She was alone, potentially jobless, facing the prospect of completely rebuilding her life at 32. The sound of a key in the front door lock made her jump from the chair. Rachel was paralyzed for a moment before forcing herself to walk into the living room. Andrew was in the doorway, his appearance a shocking contrast to the confident executive of hours ago. His suit was crumpled, his tie loosened and hanging askew, his hair disheveled. His eyes were red, possibly from crying or drinking, perhaps both. "Rachel," he began, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." "Now you want to talk?" Rachel crossed her arms, maintaining physical distance between them. "After 5 years of silence, of lies, of erasing me from your life, now you think we should talk?" Andrew took a stumbling step into the room, and Rachel realized he was definitely drunk. The smell of whiskey emanated from him in waves. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice fluctuating between rage and despair. "My career, my reputation, everything I built." "Everything you built on lies," Rachel replied coldly. "On stolen money and falsified reports. You did this to yourself, Andrew. I merely brought to light what you had been doing in the shadows." "Why?" Andrew practically screamed, his hands gesticulating wildly. "Why didn't you come talk to me in private? Why did you have to humiliate me publicly? Why destroy everything like this?" The hypocrisy of the question was so absurd that Rachel almost laughed. "Are you really asking me about humiliation? You, who erased me from your life? Who denied my existence to anyone you met? Who stole our money to finance a fantasy of being single?" Andrew sank onto the sofa, his face in his hands. For a moment, Rachel saw the man she had married, that insecure young man who worked 60 hours a week at a small firm. dreaming of success, but never sacrificing his integrity to achieve it. When had that man been lost? At what point had ambition turned into greed, and the desire to impress into a need to deceive? "I never wanted things to turn out like this," Andrew mumbled through his fingers. "At first, it was just easier not to mention I was married. People made assumptions, and I simply didn't correct them. But then it got more complicated. The more time passed, the more impossible it seemed to reveal the truth." "So you decided it was easier to just keep lying," Rachel said, anger giving way to deep sadness. "And when lying wasn't enough, you started stealing. First from me, then from the company." "I was going to return the money," Andrew insisted, lifting his face. His eyes were desperate, pleading. "I had a plan. After the year-end bonus, I was going to put everything back into our account. You never would have known." "But I would have known, Andrew." Rachel sat in the armchair opposite him, keeping the coffee table between them as a barrier. "I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to admit how much." The silence that followed was heavy with 7 years of unspoken words, broken promises, abandoned dreams. Rachel looked at the man in front of her and tried to find some remnant of the love she had once felt. There was compassion, perhaps. Pity, certainly. But love had been slowly eroded, lie by lie, until nothing remained but a painful void. "What happens now?" Andrew finally asked, his voice small like that of a lost child. "Now you face the consequences of your choices," Rachel replied. "Hansen and Partners will sue you for corporate fraud. I will file for divorce and seek restitution for the money you siphoned, and we will both have to rebuild our lives from the wreckage you created." Andrew nodded slowly, as if finally accepting the reality of the situation. "Do you hate me?" The question caught her off guard. Rachel considered carefully before answering. "No, I don't hate you. Hatred requires energy, emotional investment. What I feel is emptiness. As if the last 7 years were a dream that turned out to be a nightmare, and now I've finally woken up." Andrew stood up with difficulty, swaying slightly. "I'm going to stay in a hotel tonight. I'll come back tomorrow to get some things." Rachel merely nodded, watching him stumble toward the door. At the last moment, he turned, as if wanting to say something more, perhaps a final goodbye or one last apology. But the words seemed to fail him, and he simply left, closing the door softly behind him. The apartment was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than Rachel was used to. It was no longer the suffocating silence of unspoken secrets and avoided truths. It was the clean silence of a space finally freed from lies, ready to be filled with something new, something true. As she locked the door and turned off the lights, Rachel allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a faint but undeniably present emotion, budding through the cracks of her carefully constructed armor. It was hope, fragile and cautious, but real. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own battles. But tonight, for the first time in years, she was truly free. Morrison and Associates' office on Monday morning had the characteristic scent of strong coffee and new paper, an aroma Rachel normally associated with productivity and purpose. But today, as she walked through the glass and steel corridor on the 23rd floor of the Willis Tower, each step seemed to carry the weight of an imminent sentence. At 6:45 in the morning, the space was still relatively empty. Only a few early bird colleagues bent over their computers, absorbed in spreadsheets and reports. Diane Cartwright was already in her private conference room, accompanied by 2 people Rachel immediately recognized: Martin Cross, a senior partner at the firm and known for his unyielding stance on matters of professional ethics, sat with his hands clasped over a thick folder. Beside him was Jennifer Wu, from the in-house legal team, her shrewd eyes already assessing Rachel as soon as she entered. "Sit down, Rachel." Diane indicated the chair on the opposite side of the table, her voice professional and distant. The use of her first name was deceptively casual, a technique Rachel recognized from corporate interrogations, to create a false sense of intimacy while preparing the blow. Rachel placed her own folder on the table, meticulously organized with copies of every document, every traced transaction, every analyzed report from her 6 weeks auditing Hansen and Partners. She had spent the entire Sunday reviewing everything again, looking for any flaw in her methodology, any sign that her personal emotions might have compromised her professional judgment. She found none. "Before we begin," Martin Cross spoke, his grave voice reverberating in the acoustically designed room, "I want to make it clear that this is a formal review. Anything said here can and will be used in subsequent legal proceedings. You have the right to have an attorney present." "I don't need an attorney," Rachel replied, maintaining eye contact. "I've done nothing wrong other than failing to declare a conflict of interest, a mistake I fully acknowledge." Jennifer Wu opened a laptop, her fingers dancing over the keyboard. "Let's start at the beginning. When you were assigned to audit Hansen and Partners in October, did you know your husband worked there?" "Yes, I did." "And it didn't occur to you that this constituted a clear conflict of interest?" Rachel took a deep breath, preparing herself for the brutal honesty the situation demanded. "It did, but I also knew that our marriage was only on paper at that point. Andrew and I didn't have a shared life. He had hidden me from everyone at his company for 5 years. I rationalized that if he didn't consider me part of his professional life, there would be no conflict. That rationalization is precisely the kind of flawed logic that can destroy a firm's credibility," Martin said dryly. "Continue." "When I started the audit, my intention was purely professional. Hansen and Partners had reported inconsistencies in their tax records from the last quarter. My job was to identify the source of these inconsistencies." Rachel opened her folder, pulling out the first set of documents. The first signs of irregularity appeared in the 3rd week. Expense reports that didn't match filed receipts. Small discrepancies initially. Nothing alarming. Diane leaned forward, studying the papers Rachel had slid across the table. "And when did you realize these irregularities were connected to Andrew?" "In the 4th week. I was reviewing the travel accounts for the finance department when I noticed a pattern. Trips to conferences that had no corresponding participation records. Luxury hotels in tourist destinations over long weekends, all billed as corporate expenses." Rachel pulled out another document, this one highlighted in yellow. "This one, for example. A tax planning conference in Miami Beach during Memorial Day. The conference existed, but the list of attendees did not include anyone from Hansen and Partners." Jennifer Wu examined the documents with microscopic attention, occasionally making notes on her tablet. "And at this point, what was your reaction?" "Professionally, I intensified the investigation. Personally?" Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully. "I felt a bitter confirmation of suspicions I had harbored for years. But that didn't alter my methodology. Every subsequent discovery was documented following the same protocols I would use for any audit." The next 2 hours were an exhaustive deep dive into every aspect of Rachel's work. Martin Cross questioned every conclusion, every inference, every highlighted number. Jennifer Wu challenged her chain of custody for the documents, the validity of her sources, the soundness of her correlations. Diane remained largely silent, watching with the intensity of a hawk looking for signs of weakness. When they finally got to the joint account transfers, Rachel felt the tension in the room intensify. These transfers weren't part of the original corporate audit, Martin observed, leafing through the bank statements. How did you gain access to personal financial records? They're my records too, Rachel explained. Joint account, remember? I had legal access to all statements. And yes, I recognize that including them in the final report blurred the lines between professional auditing and personal matters. Blurred the lines. Jennifer Wu raised an eyebrow. Rachel, you practically obliterated them. A competent defense attorney could argue that this entire audit was motivated by personal revenge. They could argue that, Rachel agreed calmly, but the numbers don't lie. Every fraudulent transaction I identified can be independently verified. The falsified expense reports exist in Hansen & Partners files. The unauthorized trips are documented in corporate card records. My relationship with Andrew is irrelevant to the validity of these findings. Martin Cross closed the folder before him with a dry snap that echoed through the room. Your technical analysis is impeccable, Ms. Cartwright. Your professional ethics, however, leave much to be desired. He exchanged a glance with Diane before continuing. We will assign an independent team to review every aspect of this audit. If they confirm your findings without bias, Hansen & Partners will receive the final report. You, however, are suspended for 2 weeks without pay while we determine the appropriate consequences for your failure to declare a conflict of interest. Rachel nodded, having expected something like this. 2 weeks of suspension was almost generous, given the circumstances. It could have been much worse. One last thing, Diane spoke for the first time in half an hour. The public exposure at the party. Was it planned? The question hung in the air. Rachel knew her answer could be the difference between eventually keeping her job or losing it permanently. Not completely, she admitted. I had prepared a professional presentation of the results for the CEO. But when I arrived and saw Andrew openly flirting, maintaining his charade even knowing I was about to expose him professionally, something broke. 5 years of silent humiliation overflowed. So you allowed personal emotions to compromise a professional procedure, Martin summarized with clear disapproval. Yes, I did. And if I could go back, I would have presented the results more appropriately. Rachel maintained eye contact with everyone in the room. But I can't go back. I can only move forward and accept the consequences of my choices. When she was finally dismissed, Rachel walked down the hallway of Morrison & Associates feeling strangely relieved. The suspension was a punishment, but also an opportunity. 2 weeks to process everything that had happened, to begin rebuilding her life without the constant burden of the job that now seemed part of the problem. The elevator was empty when the doors opened. Rachel stepped in, pressing the ground floor button, watching the numbers descend on the digital display. It was only when she passed the 10th floor that she realized she wasn't alone. A man, perhaps in his 40s, in a well-cut gray suit and with kind eyes, held a folder similar to hers. "Tough morning?" he asked, with an understanding smile that wasn't intrusive, just human. "You could say that," Rachel replied, allowing herself a small smile in return. "David Chen," he extended his hand. "Divorce attorney. Office on the 12th floor. I couldn't help but notice you were in the Morrison conference room. Professional troubles? Or just a bad case?" The synchronicity of the situation almost made Rachel laugh. The universe had a peculiar sense of humor. Both, actually. And, ironically, I'll probably be needing the services of someone like you very soon. David pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. "No pressure, but if you need to talk, my specialty is complicated cases where financial and emotional issues intertwine in unpleasant ways. Rachel accepted the card, studying it briefly. David Chen, Senior Associate, Chen and Morrison Family Law. The address listed was just a few floors below in the same building. Sometimes life offered coincidences that seemed less casual and more like signs. "Thank you," she said genuinely. "I think I'll be needing to call very soon." The elevator doors opened to the bustling lobby of the Willis Tower. Hustling people streamed in and out, each absorbed in their own lives, their own dramas, their own crises and triumphs. Rachel joined the flow, stepping out onto Chicago Avenue, where the cold December wind cut through her wool coat. Her phone vibrated with a text message. It was from a number she didn't immediately recognize, but the message made it clear who it was. "Rachel, it's Patricia. Can I meet you for coffee? There are things about Andrew you need to know. Things I should have told you a long time ago." Rachel stood still on the sidewalk, pedestrians diverting around her like water around a stone. Her mother-in-law's message opened a new door, promised new revelations in a situation she had thought she completely understood. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to move on without looking back. But another part, the auditor trained to look for hidden patterns and connections, knew that understanding how Andrew had become who he was might be essential to finally breaking free from him completely. She typed a quick reply. "Tomorrow at 10. You choose the place." Then she put away her phone and started walking towards the subway station, each step taking her away from the building that represented both her professional identity and its temporary collapse, towards a future that remained uncertain, but which, for the first time in years, truly felt like her own. The coffee shop in Evanston that Patricia had chosen was small and cozy, the kind of place where Northwestern students huddled over laptops and textbooks, surrounded by the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee and baked goods. Rachel arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the corner where they could talk with relative privacy. Through the window, fogged by condensation, she watched the snowflakes begin to fall, covering the city with a white blanket that seemed to temporarily erase the urban scars. Patricia Brennan appeared promptly at 10, her navy wool coat speckled with snow, her gray hair tied in a low ponytail that accentuated the lines of worry around her eyes. She ordered a chamomile tea at the counter before joining Rachel, her movements deliberate, like someone carrying a heavy burden that she was finally about to set down. "Thank you for coming," Patricia said, cupping her hands around the warm mug as if seeking comfort in its warmth. "I know the past few days must have been hellish for you." Rachel took a sip of her own coffee, allowing the bitter liquid to give her a moment to collect her thoughts. "Hellish is an apt word, but I assume you didn't ask to meet me just to offer condolences." "No," Patricia replied firmly, her gaze fixed on the table. "I asked you to come because there are things about my son that you deserve to know. Things that explain, though don't excuse, the man he became." The barista turned on the coffee grinder, the sound temporarily filling the uncomfortable silence between them. Rachel waited, recognizing the moment for what it was. A mother preparing to betray her son's secrets in the name of a greater truth. "Andrew's father left us when he was 8 years old," Patricia began, her words measured and careful. "Richard was a salesman, always chasing the next big deal, the next opportunity. He'd promise us the world, then disappear for weeks following some scheme that inevitably failed. When he finally abandoned us for good, it was with $30,000 we had saved for a down payment on a house." Rachel felt a pang of unwanted understanding. She didn't want to understand Andrew, didn't want to find human justifications for his inhumane choices. But the professional in her recognized patterns, and this information was starting to form one. Andrew witnessed it all, Patricia continued, her eyes finally meeting Rachel's. He saw the broken promises, the humiliation when we had to move back into a tiny apartment, how I was treated by the neighbors who knew my husband had run off. He swore he would never be like his father, that he would be successful, respectable, someone people admired. So he became the exact opposite, Rachel observed, but without cruelty, just a statement of fact. Or perhaps he became exactly the same, just with a more convincing mask. Patricia sighed deeply, the exhaustion of years of carrying this knowledge evident in every line of her face. There's more. When Andrew was in high school, he started dating a girl named Lindsay. It was his first love. You know how intense those things are at that age. He was completely smitten, talked about marrying her someday. Rachel could see where this was going, and a part of her wanted to interrupt, to say she didn't need to hear this story. But another part, the auditor who sought to understand the complete picture, needed to know all the data. Lindsay came from a wealthy family, very different from our situation, Patricia explained. When her parents found out about the relationship, about where Andrew lived, about our financial situation, they forbade her from seeing him. They told her he had no future, that he was just a poor kid from Madison with no real prospects. And she agreed with them, Rachel completed, understanding the narrative. She broke up with him publicly, in front of half the school. She said he should have been honest about his situation from the start, that she never would have started dating him if she'd known he was so poor. Patricia wiped her eyes, though no visible tears fell. Something broke in him that day. He became obsessed with success, with status, with creating an image that no one could reject. Rachel absorbed this information, recontextualizing years of behavior through this new lens. It didn't excuse what Andrew had done, but it offered a psychological explanation for his pathological need to be seen as successful and unencumbered. For him, marriage perhaps represented exactly the kind of commitment and vulnerability he had learned to avoid. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rachel asked. "Do you want me to feel sorry for him?" "No," Patricia replied firmly. "I want you to understand that what he did to you wasn't about you. It was about demons he had been carrying long before you two met. And I want you to know that you're not alone in having been deceived by him." Rachel felt something shift inside her with those words. For 5 years, she had carried the humiliation of being the hidden wife, constantly questioning what was wrong with her that made Andrew want to hide her. But perhaps there was nothing wrong with her. Perhaps Andrew was simply so broken by his past that he was incapable of letting anyone truly know him. "There's one more thing," Patricia hesitated, clearly debating internally whether to reveal more. "Andrew has a savings account that I opened for him when he was a child. I put money in there for years, every extra cent I could save. When he graduated from college, there was almost $50,000. I told him it was for emergencies, or maybe for a down payment on a house when he was ready." "He used it," Rachel guessed, a final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. 3 years ago, he cleared out the entire account without telling me. When I finally asked, he claimed it was a business investment that hadn't worked out." Patricia looked directly at Rachel. "But now, knowing everything you've uncovered, I suspect it went towards the Gold Coast apartment, towards the false life he was building." Rachel leaned back in her chair, processing this new layer of betrayal. Andrew had not only stolen from her, but also from his own mother, a woman who had worked double shifts as a nurse to give him opportunities she herself never had. The audacity of it was almost stunning in its complete lack of conscience. "Are you going to sue him?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. For the money from our joint account, yes. It's my legal right, and he needs to face real consequences. Rachel paused, choosing her next words carefully. But Patricia, the money he took from you, that's between the two of you. That's not my battle to fight. The older woman nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and sad. I know. Part of me just wants to let it go, forget it, and move on. But another part knows that if I do that, I'll just be enabling the same behavior that brought him to this point. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, two women connected by a man who had failed them both in different but equally painful ways. Rachel watched the snowflakes falling more densely now, covering cars and sidewalks, transforming Evanston into a winter postcard that starkly contrasted with the emotional mess inside the heated coffee shop. "Do you still love him?" Patricia asked suddenly, the question coming out almost as a whisper. Rachel considered the question honestly, examining her feelings with the same objectivity she applied to financial audits. "I think I loved the idea of him," she finally replied. "The man I met 7 years ago. That hard-working guy who dreamed of success but still had integrity. But that man either never truly existed or died a long time ago. The Andrew who hid our married life for 5 years, who stole from me and from you, who built an elaborate lie and lived in it comfortably, that man I don't love. I don't know if I know him well enough to love or hate." "That's very mature," Patricia said with a sad smile. "More mature than I probably could be in your shoes." They talked for another half-hour, exchanging stories that filled in the blanks of their respective understandings of Andrew. Patricia spoke about the bright but insecure boy who studied late every night, determined to escape the poverty that surrounded them. Rachel shared memories of the early years of their marriage, when Andrew still seemed capable of genuine vulnerability, before the walls started to go up. When they finally parted ways on the snowy sidewalk, Patricia hugged Rachel tightly. "You deserve so much better than my son gave you," she said. "And I hope you find that, whatever better means for you." Rachel watched Patricia walk towards the parking lot, a solitary figure against the white backdrop, carrying her own version of disappointment and loss. Then she turned and began her own walk, not back to the subway, but towards the Northwestern campus, where she had studied years ago, where she had met Andrew at a graduation party that now seemed to belong to a completely different life. The campus was quiet during winter break, only a few brave students hurrying between heated buildings. Rachel found herself in front of Deering Library, where she had spent countless nights studying for her forensic accounting exams. She remembered the determination she had felt then, the certainty that she was in control of her own destiny, that by working hard enough she could achieve anything. Somewhere along the way, she had allowed that certainty to be eroded by someone else's needs and lies. She had begun to define her success not by her own achievements, but by how well she could mold herself to the negative space Andrew had created around her. She had become an expert at being invisible, at not making waves, at accepting scraps of attention and affection. But now, standing in the biting December cold with snow accumulating in her hair, Rachel felt something fundamental shift inside her. It wasn't anger, though that emotion still pulsed in her veins. It wasn't sadness, though that also remained, a dull ache that would likely take years to completely heal. It was resolution, crystal clear and unshakable. She would rebuild. Not just her career, though that was important. Not just her finances, though reclaiming the stolen money was necessary. She would rebuild herself, the person she had been before Andrew, or perhaps an even better version that embodied both the wisdom gained through pain and the strength she had always possessed, but temporarily forgotten. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from David Chen, the divorce attorney from the Willis Tower. "I managed to fit you in tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon, if you're still interested. Complicated cases are my specialty." Rachel typed her reply with fingers numb from the cold. "I'll be there. And believe me, this is definitely complicated." As she walked back through the campus towards the subway station, Rachel allowed herself to look towards the future with something akin to anticipation. There would be legal battles ahead, difficult conversations, judgments, both professional and social. But for the first time in 5 years, these challenges would be faced on her own terms, not living in the shadows of someone else's fabricated life. And that, she realized, was worth any difficulty that lay ahead. David Chen's office occupied a surprisingly welcoming space on the 12th floor of the Willis Tower, with walls painted in soft gray tones and light wood furniture that contrasted with the typical corporate coldness of law firms. Rachel sat in a comfortable armchair across from his desk, watching as the lawyer reviewed the documents she had brought, his professional expression occasionally giving way to frowns that suggested surprise or concern. "This is extensive," David finally commented, setting aside the stack of bank statements and financial reports. 5 years of meticulous documentation. You're an auditor by trade, correct?" "Forensic accounting," Rachel confirmed. "Spending years tracking corporate fraud taught me to document everything. I never imagined I'd use those skills in my own marriage." David leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced over his chest, as he scrutinized Rachel with eyes that seemed to see beyond the professional facade she maintained. "The legal issue here is reasonably straightforward. Joint account, unauthorized transfers, clear evidence of misappropriation. You have a solid case to recover at least half the diverted amount, possibly more, given that the transfers were made without your knowledge or consent." "And the divorce itself?" Rachel asked, her voice holding firm despite the dull ache the word provoked. "Divorce." A final admission that 7 years of her life had been built on foundations that crumbled under the weight of sustained lies. Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, so technically, emotional infidelity and deception wouldn't affect asset division. David explained, shifting in his seat to access his computer. But financial fraud is another story. The fact that Andrew diverted marital funds to support a separate lifestyle, to maintain a secret apartment, that definitely works in your favor in the division of assets. Rachel watched the snow continue to fall outside the window, covering Chicago in pristine white that felt ironic given the emotional mess she was navigating. "How long does it usually take? The whole process?" "It depends on the cooperation of both parties," David replied, turning his attention back to Rachel. "If Andrew contests, especially on financial matters, we could be looking at 6 months to a year. If he accepts the terms, perhaps 3 to 4 months. A year. Rachel tried to imagine another 12 months of her life, defined by legal battles and negotiations over the remnants of a marriage that had been dead for so long. But she also recognized that this was necessary, the formal process of dismemberment that would eventually allow for reconstruction. "There's something else you should know," Rachel said, pulling another document from her folder. "Hansen and Partners is likely going to sue Andrew for corporate fraud. $85,000 in falsified expenses. Does that complicate things?" David quickly read the summary Rachel had prepared, his eyebrows rising progressively. "It complicates things, but perhaps in our favor. If Andrew faces criminal charges, he might be more inclined to resolve the divorce quickly and cooperatively to at least control one front of the legal battle he's about to face." The logic made sense, but Rachel felt uncomfortable with the idea of using Andrew's professional collapse as leverage. Not because he didn't deserve the consequences, he certainly did, but because turning the divorce into a strategic game seemed to further contaminate something that was already irredeemably broken. "I want this to be fair," Rachel said carefully. "I want the money that is legally mine. I want to exit this marriage with my dignity intact. But I don't want to destroy him beyond what he's already destroyed himself." David studied her for a long moment before nodding. "That's a refreshingly mature approach. Most of my clients in betrayal cases want blood." He began typing on his computer, likely drafting the initial outlines of the divorce petition. "Let's start with the basics. Length of marriage, shared assets, debts. You mentioned a house in Oak Park?" "Technically mine," Rachel explained. "I inherited it from my grandmother 3 years ago. It's solely in my name, though Andrew contributed to upkeep and taxes." "That simplifies things. The house stays with you. You'd possibly need to reimburse him for half of his contributions, though, given the money he stole, that likely cancels out." David continued asking questions, methodically building the map of the financial and emotional territory that would need to be navigated. 2 hours later, Rachel emerged from David's office with a new folder containing the first drafts of the divorce documents, a list of additional information she would need to gather, and a tentative timeline for the process ahead. The meeting had been simultaneously devastating and liberating, making real something that until then had existed only as an abstract inevitability. Her phone vibrated as she was waiting for the elevator. A message from Diane Cartwright. "Review team finished preliminary analysis. Your findings confirmed. Need you in the office tomorrow at 9 to discuss next steps." Rachel felt a wave of relief so intense she had to lean against the wall. Confirmed. Her findings, her work, her professional integrity, all validated by independent review. The suspension would continue, of course. She had still failed to declare the conflict of interest, but at least her reputation as an auditor remained intact. When she finally arrived home in Oak Park that night, the house was exactly as she had left it. But something fundamental felt different. Rachel walked through the rooms, truly seeing them for the first time in years. The living room with its comfortable but worn sofa, chosen when they still believed in building a life together. The kitchen where they had prepared dinners in the early years, before Andrew started eating all his meals out. The bedroom they shared less and less frequently, until eventually it had become only hers. Each space held memories that now seemed to belong to strangers, past versions of herself and Andrew that no longer existed, if they ever truly had. Rachel found herself in front of his closet, contemplating the clothes he had left behind, expensive suits and designer shirts, the wardrobe of a man who had invested more in external appearance than in internal substance. Methodically, she began to remove the clothes, folding them and placing them in boxes. Not out of anger or revenge, but because she needed to reclaim this space as her own. Each item removed was a small reconquest, a declaration that this house, this sanctuary, would no longer be defined by his absence, but by her own presence. The phone rang as she was finishing the third box. "Andrew." Rachel stared at the name on the screen for several seconds before finally answering. "Rachel." His voice sounded tired, defeated in a way she had never heard before. "I received a notification from Hansen & Partners lawyers today. They're going to press charges. Criminally." "I know," Rachel replied, keeping her voice neutral. "You committed corporate fraud, Andrew. What did you expect?" "I hoped." He paused, the sound of heavy breathing audible through the line. "I hoped that maybe you could talk to them. Explain that it was a misunderstanding. That I intended to reimburse everything." The audacity of the request left Rachel momentarily speechless. After everything he had done, the lies and thefts, he still expected her to save him from the consequences of his own actions. "No," she said simply. "I won't do that. You created this situation. You need to face it." "Please, Rachel. My career is over. If there are criminal charges, I could lose my accounting license. I could go to prison. Everything I've built." "Everything you built on lies," Rachel interrupted, her patience finally snapping. "Andrew, you can't keep expecting other people to clean up your messes. I did that for 5 years. Covered your absences, lied to your family, made myself invisible to accommodate your fantasies. That's over." The silence that followed was charged with all the unspoken history between them, 7 years of unsaid words finally finding expression in Rachel's refusal to continue being complicit in his self-destruction. "The divorce papers should arrive by Friday," Rachel continued, her voice softer now but no less firm. "I'm seeking restitution for the money you embezzled, plus my share of any joint assets. The house stays with me. You can take your personal belongings this weekend, but after that, I want no further contact unless it's through lawyers." "Rachel, wait. There's nothing left to wait for, Andrew. I wasted 5 years waiting for you to become the man I thought I married. Now I realize that man never existed, or was buried so deeply under layers of deceit that there's no way to recover him." Rachel felt tears finally well up, but her voice remained steady. "I hope you find help. I hope you eventually become honest, at least with yourself. But that's no longer my responsibility." She hung up before he could respond, before he could try to persuade or manipulate her one more time. The phone immediately began to ring again, his name flashing insistently on the screen. Rachel turned the device off completely, setting it aside and returning to the task of packing away the physical remnants of a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered. Later that night, with the boxes stacked near the front door waiting to be collected, Rachel sat on the floor of her empty bedroom, surrounded only by her own belongings. The absence of Andrew's possessions created a space that felt simultaneously liberating and daunting. This was her starting point, ground zero from which she would rebuild. She thought of Patricia, carrying her own disappointments about the son she had raised. She thought of David Chen and the legal machinery now moving to formally dissolve her marriage. She thought of Diane and the review that had confirmed her professional integrity even as she admitted her ethical mistakes. All these people, all these pieces moving on a board she could barely see in its entirety. But at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Rachel had survived. 5 years of being invisible, of being denied, of being used as a financial resource while being discarded as a human presence. And now, on the other side of that survival, something new was beginning. Not recovery, not yet, but a beginning. And sometimes, she recognized, a beginning was enough. The Cook County Family Court had pale green walls that Rachel imagined were chosen based on some theory about calming colors, but which in practice only made the place seem vaguely institutional and impersonal. She sat on a hard plastic chair in the hallway, watching lawyers and couples in various stages of separation pass by, each carrying their own versions of shattered dreams and necessary new beginnings. Beside her, David Chen reviewed documents in a leather folder, occasionally making notes with a silver pen that caught the fluorescent light. Andrew was at the other end of the hallway with his own lawyer, a middle-aged man with a perpetually tired expression who had likely seen so many marriages collapse that he had stopped being surprised by the creative ways people hurt each other. Rachel avoided looking directly at her soon-to-be ex-husband, but she could feel his occasional gaze, heavy with something that could be regret or simply despair over his situation. 3 months had passed since the holiday party. 3 months of depositions and negotiations, of financial disclosures and asset divisions. Hansen and Partners had gone ahead with the criminal prosecution, and Andrew faced not only the corporate charges, but also an IRS investigation into tax evasion. His career was effectively destroyed, his reputation irreparably tainted in Chicago's financial circles. Rachel had discovered, through conversations with Patricia that continued with surprising regularity, that Andrew had moved back to Madison, living in a modest apartment while working as a freelance accountant for small local businesses. It was a spectacular fall from the Gold Coast penthouse and the office overlooking Lake Michigan. Part of her felt a grim satisfaction in that, but a larger part just felt sadness for the wasted life, for the unrealized potential. Her suspension at Morrison & Associates had been lifted after 6 weeks, with a formal reprimand in her file and a requirement to complete additional training on conflicts of interest. Diane had made it clear that Rachel was on a kind of professional probation. Her next mistake would likely be her last. But she had kept her job, her license, her ability to continue in the work she loved. Ms. Monroe. The court clerk appeared at the door, consulting a clipboard. Judge Morrison is ready for you now. The name made Rachel smile slightly, remembering that David Chen worked for Chen and Morrison Family Law, a firm founded by Judge Morrison herself before she ascended to the bench. Small synchronicities like that seemed to follow Rachel since that night at the Willis Tower, as if the universe was weaving connections she was only beginning to recognize. The courtroom was smaller than Rachel had expected, more like a formal conference room than the dramatic courtrooms of television series. Judge Elizabeth Morrison was a black woman, perhaps 55 years old, her gray hair cut in an elegant bob, eyes that seemed to see through lies, and a demeanor honed by decades of witnessing human nature in its most vulnerable forms. "Good morning, everyone," she began, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the documents before her. "I see this is an uncontested divorce, with agreements reached on all asset division issues. Is that correct?" David nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. My client and Mr. Brennan have reached a complete agreement after 3 months of negotiation." Andrew's lawyer confirmed, his monotone voice suggesting this was just one more case in a long line of marital dissolutions. Rachel watched Andrew from the corner of her eye, noting how he seemed physically smaller than she remembered, his shoulders slumped under a suit that didn't fit as well as they used to, his skin pale like someone who didn't get enough sunlight. Judge Morrison read the terms of the settlement aloud, each word formalizing the dismantling of 7 years of shared life. Rachel would keep the house in Oak Park and all the furniture. Andrew would pay restitution of $96,500, half the amount he had diverted from the joint account, to be paid in monthly installments over the next 5 years. Retirement funds would be divided according to Illinois law. There was no alimony, both being deemed professionally self-sufficient. "Is there anything further either party would like to add to the record?" the judge asked, looking from Rachel to Andrew. David shook his head negatively, but Andrew slightly raised his hand, like a child in school asking permission to speak. His lawyer sighed audibly, clearly not expecting this deviation from the script. "Your Honor, I would like to say something, if you'll permit me," Andrew said, his voice hesitant but determined. Judge Morrison considered for a moment before nodding. "Proceed, Mr. Brennan, but keep it brief." Andrew turned to Rachel for the first time since they had entered the courtroom, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact, refusing to be the first to flinch. "Rachel, I know nothing I can say can undo the past 5 years or justify the choices I made," he began, the words clearly rehearsed, but still laden with genuine emotion. "I turned our marriage into a lie because I was too afraid to be honest about who I really am. I thought if I built a perfect image, if I pretended to be someone who had no weaknesses or commitments, I would somehow become that person. The room was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the ventilation. Rachel could feel David tense beside her, likely worried that this impromptu confession could somehow complicate the carefully negotiated settlement. But she made a subtle gesture for him to allow Andrew to continue. "You deserved so much better than I gave you," Andrew continued, his voice breaking slightly. "You deserved a partner who was proud to be with you, who built a life with you instead of around you. And I am sorry, more deeply than I can express, for all the years I stole from you through my cowardice and dishonesty." Judge Morrison watched the scene with a carefully neutral expression, though Rachel thought she detected a slight softening around her eyes. She had likely witnessed thousands of apologies in this room, some genuine, many manipulative, all part of the ritual of formal separation. "Thank you for saying that," Rachel finally replied, surprised by the absence of anger in her voice. In its place was something closer to melancholic acceptance. "I hope you find a way to reconcile with who you are, Andrew. And I hope you never do this to anyone else." He nodded, discreetly wiping his eyes before turning back to face the front. The moment had passed, leaving in its wake a sense of closure that Rachel hadn't realized she was seeking. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps it was the shared recognition of flawed humanity, the understanding that wounded people often wound others not out of malice, but out of an inability to face their own hurts. Judge Morrison rapped her gavel softly, the sound echoing with a finality that seemed disproportionate to its gentleness. "Divorce granted. The terms of the settlement are accepted and legally binding. Both parties are free to move on with their lives. I wish you both peace and wisdom as you move forward." That was it. 7 years of marriage dissolved in 40 minutes of legal proceedings. Rachel signed the final documents David placed before her, her signature seeming oddly normal for something so monumental. Andrew did the same on the other side of the table, his movements mechanical like someone in shock. In the hallway afterward, while David spoke with Andrew's lawyer about final logistics, Rachel found herself standing alone near the window overlooking Daly Plaza. The Picasso sculpture was visible in the distance, its abstract and enigmatic form against the March sky that was finally starting to show signs of spring. People moved through the plaza below, each absorbed in their own lives, unaware of the small personal drama that had just unfolded several floors above. "Will you be okay?" Andrew's voice behind her made her turn. He was alone, his lawyer apparently having already left, holding a copy of the divorce papers as if unsure what to do with them. "Eventually," Rachel answered honestly. "And you?" "I don't know," he admitted, a vulnerability in his expression she had rarely seen during their marriage. "I lost my career, my reputation, you. I'm rebuilding from scratch at 34, living in the same kind of cheap apartment where I grew up. It's humiliating in ways I can't even fully process yet." Rachel felt a pang of compassion against her will. Sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what truly matters. Perhaps this is your chance to finally stop running from who you are. Andrew gave a humorless laugh. "Deep therapy, courtesy of the woman whose life I ruined. There's an irony in that." "You didn't ruin my life," Rachel corrected, realizing the truth of it as she spoke. "You terribly complicated it, caused pain that will take years to fully heal. But you didn't ruin it. I'm still here, still standing, still capable of rebuilding." They stood in uncomfortable silence for another moment, before Andrew extended his hand. "Goodbye, Rachel. For real this time." She took his hand, squeezing it briefly before letting go. "Goodbye, Andrew. Take care." Watching him walk down the hallway towards the elevators, Rachel felt something fundamentally shift inside her. It wasn't the dramatic relief she had imagined, nor the overwhelming sadness she had feared. It was something more subtle, a gradual reorganization of her understanding of herself and her place in the world. David appeared beside her, putting documents away in his folder. "Are you okay? I know this can be emotionally exhausting, even when all parties are cooperative." "I am," Rachel said, surprised it was true. "Ready to move forward." 3 weeks later, Rachel was in her backyard in Oak Park, knees soiled with earth as she planted tulips along the fence separating her property from her neighbors. Spring had arrived in full now, transforming Chicago from icy gray to vibrant green. The afternoon sun was warm on her back, and somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed its characteristic suburban tune. Patricia had visited the previous weekend, the two women spending hours talking about everything except Andrew, building a relationship that transcended their shared connection to him. They discovered common tastes for murder mysteries and true crime documentaries, both sharing a dry sense of humor that made even conversations about mundane things oddly entertaining. The house finally felt like hers, not a shared space defined by someone's absence, but a sanctuary that reflected her own tastes and needs. Rachel had repainted the bedroom a soft blue, replaced the old living room furniture, filled the shelves with books she actually wanted to read instead of those she thought she should have read. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Diane. "New client needs forensic audit. Suspected insurance fraud. Interested?" Rachel smiled, typing an affirmative reply. The work continued, her career rebuilding itself one case at a time, her reputation slowly being restored through demonstrated competence. But it was the second message that made her pause, hands still soiled with earth. It was from an unknown number. "Hi, I'm Marcus Henderson, from Hansen and Partners. I know the circumstances of our last meeting were less than ideal, but I'd like to invite you to lunch if you're interested. No hidden agenda, just admiration for someone who had the courage to do the right thing even when it was personally costly." Rachel read the message twice, processing the implications. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep her distance from anything connected to that chapter of her life. But another part, the part that was learning to embrace possibilities instead of hiding from them, was curious. She saved the number without replying immediately, returning her attention to the tulips that still needed to be planted. There was plenty of time to decide about lunches and new connections. For now, it was enough to be here, in this moment, with dirt under her nails and sun on her back, planting flowers that would bloom weeks later as living promises that growth was always possible, even after the harshest winter. The house behind her was filled with light through newly cleaned windows. Her car in the driveway was modest but paid for. Her bank account was slowly recovering. And somewhere within her, buried beneath layers of pain still in the process of healing, was the unshakable knowledge that she had survived. More than that, she had emerged on the other side not broken, but reassembled into a stronger configuration, truer to herself. Rachel pressed the last tulip into the rich, dark soil, covering it carefully and watering it with the garden hose. In a few months, these flowers would bloom in vibrant colors, transforming this corner of the yard into something beautiful. It was an obvious metaphor, she recognized with a self-deprecating smile. But sometimes obvious metaphors were obvious because they were true. As she put away the gardening tools and washed her hands with the outdoor hose, Rachel allowed herself to look towards the future without the crushing weight of the past. There would still be challenges, Scars that would never completely fade. Moments